Now let's welcome in ESPN's Jay Bilas to the 24/7 sports series we're doing called Social Distance. Jay, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Evan. How are you?
I'm great. I appreciate you coming on here. It's obviously an interesting time in our world. How are you handling the quarantine?
Just like everybody else, sort of hunkered down for the most part with my family here. And I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, so we really don't leave very much. But I think in another couple of weeks, I'll be ready for the Tour de France with all the Peloton rides I'm doing. So trying to catch up on some binge watching and reading. And I think I've done spring cleaning, fall cleaning, and now I'm into spring 2021 cleaning.
Yeah, I'm sure your wife's got you doing all the chores around the house. What's this been like for you outside of that? Are you watching any Netflix shows or what's keeping your time busy?
Yeah, at first, I didn't know really what to do. We had a lot of coverage of the cancellation of the tournament. So things were, as you know, kind of fast and furious for a little while, but that's subsided for the most part. And so now, ESPN is using some alternate programming. I mean, you've probably seen some of this sort of,
Right.
64 greatest player bracket, stuff like that, that seems trivial in the face of a global pandemic. But, when people tune in to ESPN, tune into a podcast, whatever it may be, they're looking for an escape from the news. And honestly, I don't know what you're like with this, but I can only take so much of the news and I have to turn it off.
Yeah.
It gets a little bit overwhelming at times. Not that it's not the most important thing, but I need to turn my attention away from it just for mental health reasons. But I've been trying to read as much as I can, and then I've binge watched the heck out of. I blew through Better Call Saul, which I had not seen, and I blew through 4 seasons of that, and it didn't take me long to get through the last season of Ozark, which I really like.
Yeah, I just finished Ozark last night.
Yeah, it's pretty good. The ending was somewhat predictable, but still it was good.
100%, a little bit of a slow start, but definitely a little predictable. I wanted to talk a little bit about the ACC tournament. You were there that Thursday, March 12th, and I think for a lot of people, that's when this thing came a little surreal. It was the morning after the NBA postponed their season. When you walked into the gym that day to start your coverage, did you think that there was any way that the ACC tournament was going to be finished?
No, I didn't think it would, but then it gave me some pause when, about 9:30 or so, John Swafford came on the air on the ACC network right after I was on saying they need to cancel the tournament. It's sort of a, you have to, and saying, no, we're going to play. So I was taken aback by that, honestly. I didn't think it was the right decision, but they ultimately got to the right decision. I think, it's a different trigger for different people. And I've heard a lot about, Rudy Gobert was sort of the tipping point. And I get that. But for me, the tipping point was the World Health Organization declaring this a global pandemic. I mean, that's kind of a big deal.
Right.
And so, to me, that pretty much indicated that things were going to come to a halt at some point in the very near future, whether it was Thursday morning, Thursday afternoon, Friday, that it couldn't continue. And I mean, Evan, look, I realized that Monday when the Ivy League canceled its tournament, that people looked at that and said, what? Like, why would you do that? And there were some people who complained about it. But, how ridiculous would it have looked for the ACC or any other league to be playing on Saturday? It would have looked foolish. And so I give the ACC credit, all the power conferences for pulling the plug when they did, and the NCAA for pulling the plug when it did. Like, there's a lot to complain about with the NCAA, but they did the right thing there. And it wasn't particularly well coordinated. The communication wasn't great, but those are secondary issues. They got the broad strokes right.
Right. You were on TV seemingly all day that Thursday talking about the impact, the potential cancellation of the NCAA tournament. What was that like as a sports broadcaster that's known for his preparation? How did you approach and even prepare for that type of content?
Well, I hope that's where some of my training as a lawyer was helpful in not only gathering information on what was happening, but being able to sift through what I felt should happen and hopefully framing it the right way. I don't know that I did, but I hope I did. So to me, those are the times where, it's one thing to sit and argue about who the best point guard is or which team should have been a number 1 seed. That's all great.
Right.
But me, these are the truly important things that we do, and you needed to get it right. And I think for me in our job, I think our job can be boiled down to saying the right thing at the right time in the right tone. And I think when you're facing something as serious as a pandemic, tone was really important. And you certainly wanted to be right, but you wanted to make sure you struck the absolute right tone.
For sure. I asked this question to Coach K when I interviewed him last week, and I'm curious your take on it. What did you miss most about not having an NCAA tournament this year?
Everything, really, Evan. I mean, just the normalcy. The NCAA tournament has been a normal part of my life since I was 19 years old, and so it's sort of the beginning of spring for me and for you. It's a tradition, and it's funny. My wife had said after the tournament was canceled, she said something about career trajectories are going to be altered by this. And
Yep.
she was really right. I didn't look at it that way, but it's true that there were a lot of coaches, players, maybe athletic directors, who knows, that their careers are changed by one single NCAA tournament, and that's gone. Now it's nobody's fault. It's the way it is, and I'm sure we could. I had said this at the time, and another thing where my wife had reminded me of this, that when I was a kid, I'm older than you. But when I was a kid, my grandmother used to use the same tea bag over and over again until she couldn't squeeze another, it wouldn't even color the water anymore until she used a new tea bag. And we used to tease her about it. Like, come on, Grandma, we can afford a tea bag here. You can use one for each cup of tea you make. And we weren't smart enough or mature enough to understand at that time that our grandparents had been through the 1918 global pandemic of the Spanish flu, and they'd been through World War II and the Great Depression, and things that were real hardships. And we're lucky that we've had good jobs and done fairly well. I mean, so what's the biggest hardship we have is we can't go out to dinner, and we're being asked to stay in our nice homes for a while and watch Netflix. And look, I get it that things could be better, but things could be a lot worse. And so I've sort of tried to keep it in that sort of perspective, that there are people losing businesses and jobs. Healthcare workers are stressed to the point of their health is imperiled and their lives are imperiled. I'm certainly not going to complain about, geez, I blew through all my binge watching options, and if only I could get out and do it. And I'm missing the NCAA tournament. I mean, it's pretty small sacrifice to make in the grand scheme of things.
No question. If the event had been played, who did you think would have won it all, or who did you think was the best team going into it?
I thought Kansas had established itself as the best team, but I don't think anybody could say, okay, well, that's a for sure Final Four team. Right. I kind of look back to 2015 as being one of those years where you go, okay, we know who's good this year. We know who's going to be there, absent something extraordinary happening. That you knew Kentucky was the best team. You knew that Duke and Wisconsin, with their talent and experience, were going to be there, absent an incredible upset. This year was not like that, as you know. It was a year like I can't really recall. Almost probably 2010, 2011 would be, I think, the analogs to it, where you felt like you couldn't wrap your arms around who was any good, and everybody was a little bit flawed, and the metrics proved it out. I think there were only two teams, if I remember right. There were only two teams that were ranked in the top 10 of both adjusted offense and defense. Right. And that's unusual. Usually there are more. And the spread between where a team was like the best teams, like, some of the best teams were ranked, Gonzaga was really high in offense, and then, their defense was nowhere to be found, or some team could guard the hell out of you, but they couldn't score, stuff like that. We had more of those kind of teams where I think it would have been a pretty wild ride. I still think my belief is it would have come out the same as it normally does, where you'd have mostly Power 5 teams in the Sweet 16 with some interlopers. Right. But it might have been some different Power 5 teams. We might have seen Penn State in the Sweet 16, something like that. It was a little bit of a different year in that regard.
For sure. I actually polled 115 plus coaches on who would win it all. And Kansas by far got the most votes at 49. But I was surprised. There was really only, I think, 4 that got double-digit votes. I thought it would have been a little more spread out in the polling, but I thought that was interesting. You also cover the NBA draft every year, and you're there in New York for the draft. This pre-draft process is going to look so different this year. Do you think there's a scenario where we don't see the NBA draft until August or September, or what have you kind of heard on that?
I haven't heard very much, at least nothing different than you've heard from Woj or Windhorst, guys like that. I do believe we'll have a draft. It will not be in the normal course. We're not going to have a combine. It doesn't look like, because that would normally be in the middle of May in Chicago. I don't think that's going to happen. And certainly you're not going to be able to have a draft until you have a draft order established. So they're going to have to figure that out. Now, if it goes based off of how the season has ended to this point, well, then they could have it in June if they decide to call the season off. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to try desperately to play games and to get back to some sort of a normal, it won't be a normal schedule, but some sort of finish to the year and then playoffs. But that's really the issue is what's going to be the draft order. They can have the draft. They used to have the draft via remote. Heck, back in the day when I was in college, I mean, you barely had the draft picks going up to New York. It was done in a hotel, and most of the picks were made via telephone and all that stuff. So I don't think that would be that big of a deal. I think it could be accomplished. It's just that these things are shows now, and they're communal events where people get together and they watch it. They watch them together, whether it's the NFL draft or the NBA draft, you name it. I don't know how the Major League Baseball draft goes, but it would probably be like that, where people are calling their, they don't, at least I don't think that they have all the draft prospects in one place for the Major League Baseball draft. And somebody goes up and shakes, Rob Manfred's hand. I don't think that happens. So I don't think it has to happen with the NBA. At least we could get by with it, 1 year.
If you had the number one pick in that draft and position of need didn't really matter, do you know who you would go with right now?
Yeah, I'd probably go with James Wiseman. Would be my guess. Anthony Edwards would be awfully difficult to turn down because he's so talented, but he doesn't really know how to play yet. I think he made some really good strides under Tom Crean last year, and he puts up points in a hurry. And you've seen it. I mean, what he did to Michigan State in the second half and Maui, where he put up 31 or whatever it was, just a ridiculous show, where he can make bad shots and challenge shots and make them in a hurry. Wiseman reminds me a little bit of Chris Bosh with his ability level. I think he's that type of player. But there's nobody in this draft that reminds you that you're going, okay, surefire, not going to miss. And you get past a certain point, you're kind of going, there's some players that are going into the draft, you're going, don't know if they're going to make it. Can they play in the NBA? Absolutely. But don't know that they're going to last. So This is not a deep draft. It's honestly not that good of a draft, but it doesn't mean you're not going to have really good players come out of it. It's just there's going to be a lot more mistakes made in this one. Simply, one, you have to take 60 players, have to be selected. But there's so much divergence of opinion on players. You just don't know what you're going to get with some of these guys.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be down from a depth standpoint. I think it's from an overall crop standpoint, it's going to be a lot more role players than it is going to be future superstars. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your career. When you got into broadcasting 25 years ago, did you envision this is how your career would unfold in this way?
I had thought about it, but I can't say that I envisioned it. When I was in high school, my later years of high school and into college, I had really thought that broadcasting would be something I would like to do, but I didn't really, I worked in the industry as a runner or production assistant when I was in college for ABC Sports, and I did some pretty big events. So I got to see behind the scenes and see what it was like. But after I spent 3 years on Coach K's staff at Duke as a grad assistant, I kind of thought for a while that I'd go the coaching route. But when my wife and I got married at the end of '92, we just figured for our family that's not the best way for us to go. So I had graduated law school and passed the bar exam in the state of North Carolina. So I thought, okay, well, I'll be a lawyer. That's what I'll do. And so I got a job with a big law firm here in Charlotte. And really, I don't want to say broadcasting was luck, but there was a little bit of luck involved that I got a phone call from a guy named George Habel, who was the president of something called the Capital Sports Network at the time. And they owned all the broadcast rights to the Duke basketball games and NC State and North Carolina, all that. So I started doing radio games for the Capital Sports Network, and I worked with Bob Harris doing Duke games. And one thing led to another. I didn't make any money. I think I made $200 a game plus gas money or expenses. And one thing led to another, and ESPN offered me some games, and I kind of did both for a number of years. And it was probably about 8 years of doing both my full-time law practice and then broadcasting, and finally got to where I had to choose. I couldn't do both. It was just becoming too stressful. And because law practice is the real deal. I mean, that's work. And so I chose what gave me better seats to games, and I went with the broadcast side, and I've never looked back.
What's been the most memorable moment or best memory of your broadcasting career?
Man, I've been so lucky with so many great games and so much fun with the people I've worked with. I think the thing that would stick out to most people there'd be a couple things. One would be the 6 overtime game between UConn and Syracuse in the Big East tournament, along with Bill Raftery and Sean McDonough, which was, just a joy to be able to, I mean, we're lucky to have the jobs we have, and I realize I'm very grateful. But that really was a privilege to be there for that and to listen to McDonough and Raftery that whole game. And then I'd probably say doing the years ago, ESPN used to trade me over to CBS during the tournament so they could get highlight restrictions taken off of SportsCenter. And I was lucky enough to do the Arizona-Illinois Elite Eight game in 2005, where Illinois with Darren Williams and Dee Brown made that unbelievable comeback and wound up going to the Final Four in the championship game in 2005. That was at the Rosemont Horizon. I did that game with Dick Enberg and Armin Katayan. So that was pretty cool. I'd say those would stand out.
You mentioned Raftery, and then I've been lucky enough to work with him a couple times, and he was a guy that I grew up idolizing in a lot of ways, and seems like a better person than he is even a broadcaster. I'm sure you got stories for days on him.
Yeah, Bill is one of the best people I've ever known in my life, and I count him among my most valued friends. And he is, I've never heard anybody say a bad word about him, because if they did, I mean, they expose themselves as being a fool. Like, he's just the best, and I think he's the best at this job there's ever been. But the thing I've always admired about Bill is not only his sense of his amazing feel for, to have fun and you can be serious when it's time, but he just enjoys the hell out of the games. And but more than that, like, he loves basketball, but I think he loves the people in the game every bit as much, if not more. And so our time together was more about getting together. We'd have lunch, go to practice, go to the game, go to dinner afterwards. I mean, it was just he brought joy to it, and still brings joy to it. And I mean, I first met Bill Raftery when I was in college, and when I graduated, and I wasn't even graduated, when our team lost in the national championship game in 1986. Can't remember how long after the game, but we had all the seniors on our team had gotten a framed copy of a New York Times article about our team, written by Dave Anderson, that Raftery had framed for us and had signed by Dave Anderson, and he sent it to us with a really nice note for each of us. And I still have it. I have both the note and the framed copy. And who does that? I mean, he and that's just him. He's just an unbelievable person.
I'm curious what your game prep looks like. Like, when you're getting ready to do a game, how many games are you watching beforehand? Do you have kind of it's like something you do repetitiously, or you make phone calls to the coaches, or just go to practice the day before? What's kind of your game prep look like?
I do a lot of that, and I'm sure much like you, because we're immersed in this. I think, like, I believe I'm preparing all the time. But if I have a game, say I've got Duke and Notre Dame coming up, I do talk to both the coaches beforehand. I go to practices. I try to get in the day before the game, so that I can go to actual practice instead of just a day of game shoot around. And then oftentimes I'll talk to the coaches that just played them, because usually I find out more from opposing coaches about a team than their own coaches. And then I always make a scouting report for each team. And so I do it every game, even if I have the team 10 times in a season, I still make the chart, because the way my brain works, if I write it down, I'm more likely to have it, sort of embedded in my whatever brain cells I have left. But I don't really look at it during the game very much. I try to look at it during a timeout, or maybe remind myself of something, or maybe it'll jar something in my head. But I keep those with me all the time. So I have a notebook of all my game charts and scouting reports. I watch a ton of film. I use a service called Synergy Sports Technology, which most every team uses for scouting. So I can watch whatever game I want whenever I want. And, you can watch their last 20 out of bounds plays, their last 20 turnover, whatever you want. So I use that a lot. And so I try to prepare as much as I can without trying to turn the game into a clinic. Most people that are watching are not coaches. So you try not to overwhelm the stuff with X's and O's.
You mentioned earlier that ESPN did the bracket of the greatest player of all time, and you took a pretty strong stance on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as being the greatest player of all time. My question to you is, in your 25-year career at ESPN and covering the sport, who's the best player that you've seen from you doing games and covering it?
From doing games and covering it, the best player. There's so many that you could put in there, like they're accomplished players, and Durant is probably the most talented player. Mm-hmm. I saw LeBron in high school, and he's the best high school player I've ever seen. It's not close. But I would say probably Durant, even though he played a year, is probably the best player that I broadcast. The best player I ever saw, since I got out of college, was probably Grant Hill, because I used to watch him every day in practice, and he's certainly the best Duke player I'd ever seen. And Leitner's up there too, is the most accomplished. But that's a good question. I'd have to probably sit down and put pen to paper. But your thing about like the 64 best players, to me, and this is really interesting the way the voting worked. And I know it's a lot of younger people, and I get it. I understand it, but like, to me, it's a no-brainer. It's Kareem. And I watched him, like, I can say that I watched him in college, but I was only 6 years old when he was in college. I watched him more when he got with the Milwaukee Bucks and in the 69 draft, and then later on with the Lakers. I grew up in Los Angeles, so I watched him a lot. He's the greatest offensive weapon the game's ever seen. Wherever he went to school, they were going to win 3 titles anywhere. That's how great he was. And he could play now, and he would be by far the best player. Like, Udoka Azubuike was the most dominant big man in college basketball. There's no way he could play with Kareem. No way. And that's not being disrespectful to Azubuike. That's the ultimate respect to Kareem. So to suggest that a 3-time most outstanding player and 3-time player of the year, 3-time champion, and it would have been 4 if they allowed him to play his freshman year. His freshman year, the freshman team beat the number 1 team in the country, in a game. Right. The idea that he would have lost to Shaq in the second round is like saying, well, Aaron Judge would beat Babe Ruth. No, that makes no sense.
Right.
It's ridiculous.
Well, last one before I let you go, and this is going to be putting you on the spot a little, I guess, again. But who would you put on your Duke Mount Rushmore?
Well, I put Grant Hill as number 1 because I think he's the best player to ever play at Duke. And then Christian Laettner is right there and probably the most decorated. I'd put Johnny Dawkins up there because Johnny Dawkins, I think, was the most important player Duke's ever had. Mm-hmm. Without Johnny Dawkins, I'm not sure there's a Coach K to the level of Coach K now. That's how good Johnny was. And one of the best people I've ever known. And the last one would be really hard. Like, do you go Bobby Hurley or JJ Redick or Shane Battier or what? All these, Danny Ferry. There's so many players, but I'd probably go with Hurley because Bobby was an extraordinary point guard. Great competitor, but you combine his passing, the way he could play up tempo, and then he was a great defensive player. I don't think I've ever seen anybody, at least in a Duke uniform, that could reassume pressure like him. So somebody would try to back dribble him. He could reassume that pressure and get right back up into him. He was an underrated defender.
Well, Jay, I really appreciate you taking out the time and doing this with me. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.